What is up, everyone? It is Quinn here, back with another video, and today I'm going to be going through my top 15 rookie wide receivers. So I think my last set of rookie rankings was top 12. Now we're going to be adding a few players, going through my top 15. This is going to be my last set of positional rankings before the NFL draft, and then in a day or two I'll be going through like my top 24 big board. Remember, this is going to be for like Dynasty rookie rankings. These are not for like real life NFL, so just keep that in mind. And then I'm also going to be splitting these players up into different tiers to kind of just show the groupings and what guys I have in a similar range. As always, I want to hear your guys' opinions. Let me know if you think a player is too high or too low. At this point, pre-draft, there are still a lot of things up in the air. Obviously, landing spot, but also draft capital. So maybe I think a guy's going too early. You think he's going to slip. I just want to, hear your guys' thoughts down below. So let me know, and let's just jump right into it. And starting off with my wide receiver 1 and my only tier 1 wide receiver, this is where I have Jackson Smith-Njigba. I feel like at this point, in terms of like the fantasy community, it seems like he's pretty much the consensus wide receiver 1, and it also feels like the NFL agrees. He's currently minus 350 to be the first wide receiver selected. Obviously, the major talking point with JSN is his crazy sophomore season, where he pretty much held his own with Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave, who we all know are both studs at the NFL level. And in terms of like super flex drafts, I personally like JSN as a top 4 rookie pick, so very high on him and think he's going to do great things. Now moving over to tier 2, I've got 2 guys in here. And as my wide receiver 2, I have Jordan Addison out of USC. Now, he's a guy who I do think his stock fell a little bit throughout the pre-draft process. Came in a little small at 5'11", 173. At that size, he didn't test great. Had a 19th percentile speed score, 37th percentile burst, but we all know he's still a wildly talented wide receiver. He was Pitt's wide receiver 1 as a freshman, had a crazy sophomore season, played 14 games, caught 100 passes for 1,593 receiving yards and 17 touchdowns. Then for his junior year, transferred to USC, 11 games, 59 receptions, 875 receiving yards, and 8 touchdowns. He may not be a guy who has a crazy high ceiling of like a top 5 fantasy wide receiver, but I think he can be very, very productive. Maybe a high-end wide receiver 2 throughout his career. Has a few peak seasons where he jumps into the top 10, and his draft capital has slipped a little bit. He's probably going to be going later round 1, which I do think could end up being a win if he lands on one of these top offenses, connected to a great quarterback. Now, my wide receiver 3, also in tier 2, going to be Quentin Johnston out of TCU. And similar to Addison, I feel like he didn't really do himself any favors when it came to his athletic testing. Not saying he tested poorly. His 40 was in the mid-5s, 66th percentile speed score, really strong 98th percentile burst score, but he was a guy who was billed as just this athletic freak. He was just going to dominate, every testing metric, and that kind of made some of his flaws seem less important. I still think he's a guy who's going to end up in the first round. Could have a similar thing to Addison where he ends up, having a really strong landing spot because he does slip a little bit. But I definitely feel like you don't feel as great about Johnston as you did just a few months ago. Now shifting into my third tier, my wide receiver 4, this is where I have Zay Flowers. And it looks like the NFL is very, very high on Zay Flowers. He's currently the betting favorite to be the second wide receiver off the board, ahead of both Addison and Quentin Johnston. He's a guy who had pretty minimal production his freshman year, but then broke out in 2020, 11 games, 56 receptions, 892 receiving yards, and 9 touchdowns. And then despite some tough quarterback play, Flowers managed to account for over 35% of his team's receiving yards in both 2021 and 2022. So maybe the counting stats didn't look crazy. I think especially that junior year, like the counting stats don't look great, but he was a huge, huge focal point of his offense in both of those seasons. And I do think if he gets a favorable landing spot, and maybe Addison and Johnston don't, we could have a legit conversation about him jumping into tier 2, or maybe even jumping those guys within that tier. Now, sticking around in tier 3, at my wide receiver 5, I have Josh Downs out of North Carolina. Personally, a big fan of Downs. What he did in his sophomore season was truly incredible. 13 games, caught 101 passes for 1,335 receiving yards and 8 touchdowns. It's even more impressive when you point to the 39% target share and 40% of the team's receiving yards. I do understand some of the concerns. Size-wise, he is pretty undersized, 5'9", 171, but I do think he can be very effective out of the slot in the NFL. And at this point, it looks like the draft capital is probably fallen somewhere on day 2. Was hoping he'd get some, maybe late round 1 hype, early round 2. I think pretty much he could go anywhere, round 2, round 3, somewhere in that range. Now, my final tier 3 player is going to be Jalen Hyatt, my wide receiver 6. And I feel like looking at this wide receiver class, he has to probably be the biggest wild card, if not one of the biggest wild cards here. He's a guy who didn't hit 300 receiving yards in 2020 or 2021. And typically, right, if you're ranking a wide receiver this high, it's not a great sign when they're not breaking out until their junior season. Looking at the 2021 season, Hyatt was outproduced by Cedric Tillman, who's also in this class, Velus Jones, who just did absolutely nothing as a rookie, and then Javonte Payton, who I believe is currently in the XFL. So it's not great that he wasn't deemed good enough to play over any of those guys. But I mean, when he got the opportunity, he absolutely exploded. Caught 67 passes for 1,267 yards and 15 touchdowns. But then you also have the fact that Tennessee used him very creatively, and they put him in some really, really strong opportunities, to win different plays, which is something we just don't know if that's going to be able to carry over to the next level. At this point, I wouldn't be shocked if he was a hit at the next level, and I just also wouldn't be super surprised if he just totally flamed out. I feel like people, have kind of polarizing views on him. Either they're very, very in or they're very, very out. So maybe me having him ranked here at wide receiver 6, I'm probably not going to get any shares anyway because someone is going to reach for him. But I guess we'll kind of just wait and see. Now in tier 4, I just have one player here, my wide receiver 7, Marvin Mims. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like the NFL is overly high on him, but I would still be expecting day 2 capital. I can't see him falling to like round 4, round 5. He was Oklahoma's wide receiver 1 for all 3 of his college seasons. He's not a guy who's going to have a crazy high target share, but he can totally make the most of his opportunities. 22 yards per reception as a sophomore, and then repeated that pretty much with 20 yards per reception as a junior. Now shifting into tier 5 as my wide receiver 8, I already mentioned this guy. It's going to be Cedric Tillman out of Tennessee, just like Jalen Hyatt. And I think he's going to start the biggest tier here with tier 5. And Tillman is a guy who did have a very late breakout, pretty much a non-factor in his first 3 college seasons, then exploded in 2021 for 1,081 receiving yards and 12 touchdowns. And it looked like early on in 2022 that he was going to repeat that big season. Started off with 2 strong games, 6 for 68, and then had a 9 for 162 and a touchdown. Then he suffered an ankle injury week 3, which held him out for most of the season. He returned later on, looked a step slower, but he did cap off the season with a 9 for 81 and 2 touchdown performance. I feel like the NFL does seem to be fairly high on Tillman. I would be expecting him to go somewhere in round 2, probably at worst round 3. So definitely someone to keep an eye on, especially if he can secure solid round 2 capital, especially early round 2. It could be someone who's very interesting. Now at wide receiver 9 here, I have Kayshon Boutte, and he's just a really, really tough guy to rank because we're kind of getting to the point with these wide receivers where in rookie drafts, I'd probably prefer to just throw shots at different running backs. But if you're drafting Boutte, you're definitely hoping he can kind of find that 2020, 2021 form. He had that sophomore season where he was looking very solid, shortened by an ankle injury. He's had 2 surgeries on that ankle, and it's kind of a tough reality, but it's possible he's just not going to be the same guy physically, coming off of that ankle injury. He had a very disappointing junior season and then pretty much tanked the combine aside from like a decent 40 time. I think he's one of the players I'm most interested to see where he gets drafted. Like, is he even going round 2? Is he going round 3? I mean, if he's fallen to day 3, which I wouldn't expect, but if he does, you just have to imagine the medicals are not looking good there. Also in tier 5, I have A.T. Perry out of Wake Forest. He's a guy here where if I'm going to take a shot on one of these wide receivers, let's just take a swing on a super physically talented one. 6'3.5", 195 pounds. Ran a 4.4 740. He is an older prospect at 23, but he also has 2 seasons with big-time production. Best season came in 2021, caught 71 passes for 1,293 receiving yards and 15 touchdowns. Another guy here, you're kind of just hoping he gets picked somewhere in day two. Probably looking at more round 3 if we're being realistic. Now, my wide receiver 11, still in tier 5, Xavier Hutchinson out of Iowa State. He's a guy I was a little bit higher on a few weeks ago, but the lack of NFL hype is just tough here. He's an older prospect as a 23, almost 23-year-old, and he's not a guy who's going to wow you athletically, but I also don't think he's like a complete liability in that area. He's a guy with 3 strong seasons of production and had a big 2022 on a very tough offense where he saw 34.1% target share and had 37% of the team's receiving yards. I do think he's someone who can be a solid volume option out of the slot and is someone who could be interesting in PPR leagues. Then for my final player in tier 5, I have Tyler Scott out of Cincinnati. He's a player who had a third-year breakout in 2022. He played a role as a sophomore, 520 yards for 5 touchdowns, but in 2022, definitely his biggest season, 11 games, 54 receptions, 899 yards, and 9 touchdowns. I think at this point, he's someone who's probably also going to be going off the board on day 2. Kind of a trend here with a lot of these guys. Don't know exactly where, round 2, round 3, but somewhere in day 2 is probably where he is going to fall. Now, shifting into my final tier, tier 6, my wide receiver 13, I have Jonathan Mingo out of Ole Miss. He's a dude who had super limited production as a freshman, had a role as a sophomore, but averaged under 50 yards a game, started showing signs of a breakout in 2021, but only logged 6 games, caught 22 passes for 346 yards and 3 touchdowns. And then his senior season, his best year, 51 for 861 and 5 touchdowns. Now, looking at that production, it's definitely not ideal. I think what you're kind of shooting for here with Mingo is he's super physically talented, 6'1", 226, ran a 4.46 40, which at 226 is very impressive. 96th percentile speed score, 91st percentile burst score. I think he's someone the NFL is probably going to like more than you would expect, just looking at the production, because he is so physically talented. The issue is, though, if you are that great physically, like, why are we waiting until the senior year to have the big breakout? That would be the concern there for me. But, I mean, if you're picking someone here, wide receiver 13, you might as well just throw a dart on someone who does have that physical talent. Now, at wide receiver 14, have Rashee Rice out of SMU. He was a guy who had decent production in his first 3 seasons, but really had the breakout here in 2022. 12 games, 96 receptions, 1,355 receiving yards, and 10 touchdowns. Kind of similar to Mingo here, but just definitely not ideal to have a late breakout, especially here at SMU against lesser competition. But, like I said, throwing darts at this point. And then to wrap up these rankings, my final player here in tier 6, Tank Dell out of Houston. He's a guy who went for 1,300 plus receiving yards the past 2 seasons. The clear red flag here, 5'8", 165, very, very undersized. Also an older prospect at 23 years old, which isn't ideal. Despite some of those physical limitations, he was still a guy who was able to win at all 3 levels, a super fun guy to watch play if you're just trying to look at highlights, and he also is a very solid punt returner, so that could be a factor that kind of helps him make a roster. Like I kind of mentioned, a lot of these back end of the wide receivers, I'd probably be punting the position in my rookie drafts and looking to throw darts at either running backs or tight ends, but if you are interested in these guys, laid them out here with these tiers. But that is going to wrap it up for my top 15. Let me know what you guys think. If you stuck around all the way till the end, thank you. Do me a huge favor, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and then stay tuned for my top 24 big board. But thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.